Welcome to this first lecture in our series on contemporary theological issues. We are going to be discussing in depth some of the things that may not all be included in the text. However, the text includes the references and resources that will help you understand this course in combination with these lectures. So let's get started. As we look at this whole topic, we must realize a couple of things: that in the last 40 to 50 years, we have seen a tremendous theological transaction going on in the Christian community of faith. Some of that is obviously for good, and a lot of that has been very troublesome. And so there are people out there like myself who see that, and without being critical in a negative way, we help identify that. And I think some of that comes from my training in apologetics and philosophy, and also in the biblical studies category too, because we need to obviously stick to the key reference point, which is the Word of God. So let's get started. Theology. What is it? And let's define that, and we'll also take a look at what doctrine is too, because we'll find out as we get into that subject that it is not all the same. Theology. Our dictionary often refers to theology as a reflection on the nature and the being of God. And I took that particular definition out of the Oxford Dictionary of World Religions, and I think it's a good place to start. It's not the ultimate definitive, but it's a very good place to start. We reflect, or we look at and see psychologically, spiritually, and maybe a little visually through the Word of God in the printed format, a reflection of the nature and the very being of God. And that's important. I think when we look at these various things, we have to come into a more of a concise, typical definition that I like to use a lot of times when I'm teaching in different places I go to speak. Theology is the study and the understanding of, first of all, who God is, what God has done, and why God has acted or accomplished what he has. And I think when we look at it maybe from those 3 points, we can understand what theology is and try to grasp a little more depth that can be applied to a personal way in our lives. First of all, who God is his identity. Okay, and this is vast. This is not something you just go, well, that's who he is. And this is a vast definition. It's a deep and broad and wide. And any way you can describe direction, that's basically what you're going to come up with in this situation. What God has done actually deals with the historical facts around the progression of God's interaction with mankind. That's a lot to say, but it is very accurate. What God has done details the history of God interacting with man. And of course, the beginning of that is creation. And we'll talk about that in a minute, how that all fits together. And then why God has acted in the way he has, or accomplished what he has set out to accomplish, or is accomplishing what he wants to accomplish ultimately, tells us of his purposes. God has a purpose for everything he does. He's not random. He's not eclectic. He has a purpose and a plan, and he always has. It's because he is God Almighty, God Omniscient, God Omnipotent, God omnipresent, and we'll get into that as we go more through our lesson to come. Theology is really the essential use of a philosophy or a philosophical thought that makes an attempt to understand God. Okay, so we are trying to figure out who God is, and that is the core essence of theology, and we do that through formats of philosophy and thought and analytical thought, and all types of things that we bring into this picture of saying, what is theology? And that's, as you can see right now, we're just a couple of minutes into this, and we've already got a very, very wide picture of what theology is. Well, I think to help us understand what theology is even more, we have to understand that theology makes some statements, and they're very definitive statements, and they're rooted in history. They're rooted in the obvious. Sometimes we look at the scriptures and we see implicatives about God, where it may not say something in line item or in verbatim, but it will bring definite implications of what God is doing, why God is doing it, and even who God is. And so the scriptures bring into effect, and theology through the scriptures bring into effect some major statements. And there are basically three universal statements, facts that surround the Christian community of faith and create what we call as the core or the bedrock of Christian theology. Now, we're not going to talk about the theology of Buddha. We're not going to talk about the theology of Hinduism. We're not going to talk about the theology of Islam or anything else. We're going to talk out from a Christian standpoint. So it's important, if you want to know what theology is about other religions, you have to go and study those. We're going to look at what Christian theology is and what the bedrock, the foundation of that is in the Christian community of faith, no matter where you're at in the world. Okay? And this is the orthodoxy of Christian faith, the straight talk, the bottom line, foundational thought. And here's three major statements that bring into focus the real core issues of theology. Now, obviously, they don't define everything in someone's belief system, or in a denomination's belief system, or in a particular congregation's belief system. But they give that foundation by which those other beliefs, which we will refer to in just a few minutes, can rest upon or can be defined from. Okay? First of all, God is creator of all that is. We see this in very many ways, in evidence by the world we live in the scriptures, and a lot of different things. If God is not the creator of everything, there is no need for Christian faith. There just isn't. If God didn't create everything, then there would be no reason for us to be redeemed as Christians and brought back into relationship with God through Jesus Christ. God created all that is, and He is that source. He is that foundational issue of creation, that bottom line of all truth. So we have to understand that. Secondly, Jesus Christ is God's Son, and He provides salvation through His death, His burial, and His resurrection. And that's a pretty concise statement that we derive from scriptures. We also see the evidence of it in the practicality and the longevity and the durability of the church, which is the primary tool of the kingdom, the rule and authority of God. So, when we look at that, we see that Jesus Christ is that key source of our salvation, and He accomplished salvation through His death on the cross, through His burial and His resurrection into new life. And all of those things have strong implications, which we will talk about in the lectures to come. I'm just basically trying to put the parentheses around the basics here. God is creator, Jesus Christ is God's only Son, and we have salvation through Him by His death, His burial, and His resurrection. We do not have salvation through Jesus by the wisdom that He imparted, even though that's great to have. Even though we should know what Jesus was saying, we should understand His morality and His desire for us to live a reflective life of His. But ultimately, salvation comes in His death, burial, and resurrection. Finally, the third point is that the scriptures have a definable value. They hold a definable value. They have worth. Now, there's a lot that comes out of that one, and we'll break that down a little bit more as we get into the section that we study on the scriptures and what they are and how that has been modified and changed and developed and reread and reinterpreted and rethought through here in the contemporary world that we're experiencing right now. When I talk about the contemporary world, let me just put a little definition around that. Basically, I'm talking about, especially here in North America, from the late 1950s, early 1960s forward. Now, that does not mean that we dwell in those first couple of decades, 50s, 60s, and 70s, but that's where the roots of what we now call a contemporary culture that we're in started, and especially in the late 1980s. We'll talk about that more in later lectures. The scriptures hold a definable value. Jesus Christ is God's Son, and we have salvation through Him in His death, His burial, and His resurrection. And God is the creator of all that is. And when we know these three things, then we have a better idea of the statements that theology in the Christian community of faith is making. Now, let's look at doctrine. Many times doctrine is confused with theology, or they are shoved together in the same definitive words, and they're not. They are simply not. You have theology and you have doctrine. The reason we know this is because there are so many different kinds of denominations, sects, and congregations and belief systems within Christianity, even based on the foundation of the three statements we just examined. So doctrine can vary, and you can have various teachings and still have the same theology foundation, the same bedrock by which you're building the Christian community of faith on. Jesus gives the parable of the man who built his house upon the sand, and when the winds and the waves came, it was tore down and it destroyed. And then he says, but the wise man built his house on a rock, a solid foundation. And he doesn't tell you exactly what the house looks like. He just says he built a house on it. And that foundation held the house firm when the storms came. Now, there might be different styles of houses. And I think because of the personalities of people in the world, the mentality types, and the different world views outside of theology that people have, that tends to show us that there can be a lot of diversity in the Christian community of faith. We have to be careful that we don't allow diversity to represent sin, okay? But we can't allow that diversity to represent something that is not scriptural. And again, we're going to touch on these points the further we go into these lecture series. So, different doctrines can still define the same orthodox theology. That's important to understand. So, let's define the word orthodox real quickly so we get a picture of that. We are not talking about the Eastern Orthodox Church. We are not talking about national orthodoxy in various countries throughout Europe and throughout the Russian peninsulas and even into Egypt and Ethiopia and down into Africa like that. We're not talking about the brand of churches. We're using the word orthodox to define the bedrock of theology. And it's simply this: the word orthodox in the theological context is referenced as following traditional and generally accepted beliefs. In other words, there's a universality of those beliefs. That particular definition, it comes out of the Oxford English Dictionary, and I think that's a very, very easy one to remember, and it's one we can always go back to and say, that's orthodox. This is what has been generally accepted, and we can even tag a little bit more into that through the scriptures or through the study of scriptures and through the earliest church fathers and doctors who wrote theology out for us. There's a very good illustration that I like to use that points out kind of the differences between theology and doctrine. Here we have two frames with the identical same picture in them. We have one frame that is what we call portrait style, and it has the gold background with the green cross in it. And then we have this other one, which is a landscape style frame, longer than it is taller, and it has the same picture in it. Now, as you can see, the same picture looks somewhat different in each one, and it's because the frames are different, made differently, and they have different color scheme to them. They might look good in one room or they wouldn't look good in another one, that type of thing, and neither one of them might look good in some people's rooms. So this is exactly the image that we have of theology, the same picture, being in doctrine a different frame. Now, has the theology changed any? No, it's the same bedrock orthodox theology, but the frame can make it look differently, and usually does, especially depending on where you hang the frame and the different colors, the different manufacturers, the different styles of material used in the frame do that. And that's likewise in churches, in congregations, and denominations with different doctrine. The same foundation is there in their theology, but the doctrine makes the theology sometimes look a little askew or a little different. Now remember those three statements that we made that create that foundational theology. And that foundational theology is made on those three statements, and that keeps that picture the same no matter what the frame may be around it. Some frames are very ornamental, some frames are very plain and simple. And that still offers some type of doctrine around the theology. Okay? So, those three statements are that God is creator of everything and all that is. Jesus Christ is his only Son, and we have salvation through him in his death, burial, and resurrection. And then last of all, the scriptures hold a definable value. Now that value can vary from group to group, but they hold a value. They are not worthless and they are not discarded. Okay? And that's where a lot of the doctrine comes out, is that point 3, usually. Not all the time, and that's the issue. So with that in mind, now let's look at a few examples of different doctrines, and that way we can see how people vary and how different Christian communities of faith can obviously see things differently and still hold to the same theology. One example is baptism. Baptism has caused a lot of schisms and a lot of splits in churches. And sometimes the split is only in doctrine, it's not in theology. But we look at technique. Sometimes we say, well, is it immersion? Is it sprinkling? Is it dunking? Is it for adults only, or is it for adults and children, or is it children only? And you see all of this come into the different doctrines surrounding baptism. Now, what is baptism? Well, theologically, baptism is one's identification with Jesus Christ and with his church. And Paul very clearly tells us that baptism is like circumcision to a Jew. It identifies them as who they are. Okay, so we have to take that from the theology. From there, it can go a multitude of places. Another one of these things is the return of Christ, the second return of Christ, eschatology. And boy, have there been many a fights over this one. Have there been many a separations over this one. And what we see a lot of happening right now, especially in North America and the contemporary theological issues, is kind of almost like, I don't want to talk about it. No. And we need to talk about it, but we don't need to criticize one another about it. And simply the return of Christ breaks into about 4 or 5 different types of doctrines, key things, one being amillennial, one being premillennial, postmillennial, or what we call intimate return of Christ, which has nothing to do with the first 3 and just simply says that, when I die, Jesus comes for me, and that's the way it is. And so there is no literal return and all of the things and all the trappings that we typically surround the teachings with end time studies. So that's another doctrinal issue. Another one is Holy Communion, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. And this is where especially sectarianism breaks apart quite a bit. Not so much, and then denominationalism too, but we see it more in the sectarian groups, okay? And we see that it could be dynamic, where there's a spiritual impartation in the taking of communion. It could be symbolic, which means simply we do it for a reason, but the elements have no meaning basically other than just to give us a physical picture of something that Christ has told us to do. There might be consubstantiation in some churches, especially the Lutherans, who believe that the presence of Christ is on, in, and around the elements, even though they are not transformed into anything. So when you take communion, you are receiving Christ with the elements. There's another one that the Roman Catholics believe called transubstantiation, where the elements actually become the body and blood of Christ, even though they don't look like it. Even though there's no change in the natural appearance of them, they actually become that by the blessing or the words of the priest which are said. So there's a lot of doctrine. There's a lot of variances. Is the core theology the same? Well, we have to ask those 3 questions. Is God creator of all? Is Jesus Christ our salvation through his death, burial, and resurrection? And do the scriptures hold a definable value? And if the answer to all 3 of those is yes, we have a Christian community of faith with varying doctrines. And that is very interesting to comprehend, because we often want everybody to think just like we do. And so theology and doctrine have to give us room to say they can see that differently. What is their theology? And this is where things get really blurred together, and where we're going to address several of the contemporary theological issues in the next few lectures. And I hope you'll enjoy those as we go through them.